Welcome to our presentation on cross-cultural communication. Our team members are Karlene Clark, Leanne McDonald, and Sarah Smith. The presentation will cover many aspects of verbal and nonverbal communication, as well as strategies toward achieving more efficient interactions across cultures. What is cross-cultural communication? It is important to break down this phrase by first examining the word culture. According to author Schwang, culture consists of shared values, attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and language used within a social group. It also influences the way we shape group and individual values, form assumptions, perceptions, and guides us in a socially acceptable manner for thinking, actions, and rituals. Ross and Nielsen also point out that culture is not the same as ethnicity, and cultural behaviors are learned. Cross-cultural communication then refers to the manner in which individuals of different cultures' values, patterns of thinking, and behavior vary from one another in their attempt to come to an understanding of each other. The vast differences in cultures bring with it many challenges for effective cross-cultural communication. Within verbal communication, the areas of semantics, word connotations, tone, and perception are full of differences based on values, gender, and time. According to author Geary from 2006, cross-cultural communication entails many challenges to be overcome, since each human person will vary in their personality. Culture is an added dimension that creates the need for greater understanding of areas such as semantics, because the same words often mean different things depending on the culture. For example, in the southern United States, bless your heart means a person might feel sorry for you or look down on you, while in the Midwest, it's a way of saying thank you. Word connotations are important and can be taken as positive or negative depending on the audience. In one culture, using the term pushy might be a compliment, whereas in another it might be an insult. Similarly, the tone of a conversation or speech could be harsh, calm, dull, or exciting, and it can carry with it differing outcomes based on a person's culture or perception. Different cultures place a higher importance on verbal and nonverbal communication. For example, both Americans and Europeans give greater weight to a person's word, whereas Eastern cultures assign a deeper meaning to nonverbal communication. According to author Berlanga Cortez, in the African American, Hispanic, and Asian cultures, speakers are expected to look at listeners directly in the eye, while listeners are expected to avert eyes to indicate respect and attention. The exact opposite is true of Anglo-American listeners and speakers. That is why it's so important to understand cultural differences when communicating.
To better explain the ways in which we come to understand differences, we can turn to Milton Bennett's developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. He explains how people move from ethnocentrism, which means that they see cultural differences as either non-existent, something to defend against, or totally unimportant, to ethno-relativism, in which people begin to accept and adapt to other cultural norms in order to communicate effectively with people outside of their native culture. The developmental model consists of 5 major stages. The first is when people deny that there are cultural differences. In the second stage, they defend themselves against any perceived differences, or they adopt an us versus them type of attitude. In the third stage, people recognize differences, but then try to minimize them. In the fourth, they come to accept that there are differences. And in the final stage, people apply that acceptance and adapt their behavior, which Bennett describes as intercultural empathy. Of course, it is imperative to understand the ways in which cultural differences affect the ways we communicate, from everyday conversations to more formal communication like business meetings. For instance, in a study by Youngsia, Nell, and Bott, communication strategies of Chinese, Indian, New Zealander, and South African business managers were compared. It was found that in more power-oriented cultures like China and India, it is more important to use more unique and irreplaceable communication strategies. and these help to form more meaningful relationships. While in more egalitarian cultures like New Zealand and South Africa, there is more of a tendency to treat everyone like equals and use more replaceable communication strategies. Additionally, Chinese and Indian business managers use more interpersonal strategies for forming business relationships, like one-on-one meetings, while New Zealand and South African managers preferred impersonal strategies like public meetings. However, all four cultures involved in the study use interpersonal methods of maintaining relationships. There are several theories and factors that explain how people create and maintain relationships, both cross-culturally and within their own cultures. Hofstede's cultural dimensions are a great starting place. One of those dimensions is power distance, which shows the degree to which less powerful members of a society understand and accept the unequal distribution of power. In a culture with low power distance, members strive for a more equal distribution of power and want justification for inequalities. In societies with high power distance, it is just understood that everyone has a place and no justification is required. Collectivistic cultures are more focused on the group, on the family or particular in-group. Individualistic cultures tend to focus more on the individual and immediate family. It essentially comes down to I or we. Interestingly, in collectivistic cultures, there is a higher level of self-disclosure, whereas the opposite is true for individualistic. Another theory is Edward T. Hall's cultural factors. One of his factors is context. In a culture that has low context, misunderstandings are less likely because the culture relies less on contextual clues. In a high context culture, there tends to be more room for misunderstandings because communication relies more on unwritten rules. For instance, a low context culture is less likely to use metaphors and reading between the lines, whereas low context cultures rely more on straightforward and clear messages. The way in which a culture views time is also an important factor. Low context cultures tend to be on monochronic time, which emphasizes promptness and doing the job that's at hand. It's not necessarily about simply getting the job done, it's about when it will get done. Polychronic is the opposite and is seen more in high context cultures. Promptness isn't necessarily a big deal, and the focus is placed more on the relationship as opposed to the task. Of course, there are more cultural factors and dimensions than the ones we've listed, but these seem to give good insight into how members of a culture approach communication, both within their own culture as well as with members of other cultures. Looking at attending skills is also a great way to gain insight into how a culture communicates.
Attending skills are the nonverbal anchors necessary to the microskills that we need to learn before moving on to the more complex skills like listening, questioning, or summarizing. Because attending skills are different across cultures, caution needs to be exercised, and we overlook these cultural differences at our own peril and might be violating deeply held cultural values that lead us to being perceived as arrogant or rude. For example, personal space. In the United States, 1.5 to 4 feet is considered appropriate, while in the United Kingdom or Norway, it is too close and pushy. In Latin America or the Mediterranean, it's too distant or unfriendly. Other body language includes differences noted here. For many Eastern cultures, the side-to-side nod or the head waver means agreement, and the vertical means disagreement, rather than the American nod for yes and head shake for no. Lessons like stand up and look me in the eye are not something formally taught. These are learned. For middle-class Anglo-Americans, eye contact is one of the most powerful cues we have for opening and maintaining communication. It's been described as a visual handshake that connects you non-verbally with another person. It's seen as warmth, interest, and a desire to communicate. Breaking that contact indicates a loss of interest, inattention, or dislike. These cultural cues are also noted through our patterns of speech. The same words and behaviors may serve these different functions in different cultures. For example, dragon is a symbol of luck, power, and prosperity in Chinese culture. So expressing the concept of people saying that your child is a dragon may result in misunderstanding in Western culture, as to us, dragon is some kind of a vicious animal. Other body language includes the Duchenne smile. This is an authentic, involuntary reaction where the muscles around the eye contracts, producing that crinkly-eyed effect that doesn't happen in a polite, lips-only face smile. Posture such as slumping, can also signal boredom or discouragement, while rigidity suggests disagreement. Closed posture with crossed arms oriented away from others convey disagreement, no matter what you say. When you give these mixed messages, especially across cultures, people are going to trust the nonverbal cues that they were raised with. You may also be sending unintended messages about your professional status or role within the organization based on what you wear. Do you look knowledgeable and well-kept? This can impact if others want to approach you. Style is not the extra bits like cake frosting. Rather, it's the ingredients of a linguistic cake. These include pitch, intonation, voice quality, lexical and syntactic choice, rate of speech, and turn-taking, as well as what's said and how understanding is achieved. Most notably, few speakers are aware of their own style. Instead, they use all of these ingredients to determine the intentions of others. Such as Midwest nice. The Midwestern dialect is so subtle that people not immersed in it for decades can't hear it. Being from the Midwest myself, I can relate to a 2015 blog that said people from outside the plains think they can mimic us by elongating some O's, but in truth we communicate far more in what we have to say or fail to say entirely. To live in the Midwest is to experience two realities. The first, all sunshine and bland pleasantries among other potluck suppering churchgoers. The other, a red-lit underworld where people relay vulgarities through the learned second language of euphemism, eye rolls, and loaded silence. We are the alpha and omega of passive aggressiveness. So leads into pacing and pausing as another example of style. When it comes to pauses, some cultures see lengthy ones as inattention. To Native American cultures, it's a sign of attention and respect, where they take the statement seriously before giving a worthy answer. Some, however, prefer fast speech with an overlap in their discussions. These are known as crowders. Pauses are non-existent in the Northeast, specifically researched in the area of the New York Jewish population. Silence in this case is an indication that there's a lack of rapport. Instead, they use latching, a term that indicates that they latch on to the last bit of conversation and pick it up sometimes before the last speaker is even done. This relates back to the crowders, the interrupters mentioned earlier, who pick up conversation, turning it back to talk about themselves. This enthusiastic style of communication is difficult for those that prefer time to think before responding. But for those using this style, they feel that talking about themselves isn't selfish, but rather it's an encouragement for others to share likewise about themselves, again, building rapport.
So in conclusion, culture encompasses the place, language, gender, education, religion, and history of a group. These aspects define the culture and accepted behaviors and communication of each group. Understanding how to effectively communicate across cultures will contribute to effective interpersonal business and political communication.
Several theories and models have been created in order to better explain how people communicate across cultures. They describe things like the emphasis cultures place on groups, power, and time, as well as how individuals adapt to communicating with people from other cultures. All of these things can be tied together and help to give insight into cross-cultural communication.
In conclusion, the emotional aesthetic experience of a perfectly tuned conversation is as ecstatic as an artistic experience. The satisfaction of having communicated successfully goes beyond the pleasure of being understood in the narrow sense. It is the gratification of one's place in the world and one's way of being human. We'd like now for people, based on this presentation, to please share an example of cross-cultural miscommunication or a positive experience that you've had. Explain the verbal and the nonverbal messages involved and how they've affected the communication.